So let's talk a little bit about how it's organized. Kip, what's the first? Basically, it's broken into three main parts, right? What are those parts?
Yeah, so there's three parts. So there's the core, that's called the framework core, and that's really where all the all the meat of the framework is. That's one. Then there's implementation tiers, and there's four of those, and that's kind of like a maturity model, right? So it's kind of a bigger picture perspective on the framework. And then the last major part is a what's called a profile, and that's where you can actually tailor the framework to your organization. So those are the three major parts. And so, Jason, why don't you start unpacking the core, if you will? Like, what's in the framework core?
Sure. When we look at the framework core, it's really organized around five key functions that we do concurrently and continuously. These are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And these make a lot of sense to us, right? Because if we're starting to think about some bad person trying to break into our network, we need to have a way to identify what is our network so we know what we want to protect. Then once we've identified everything, we have to figure out what protections we're going to put in place. What are the controls? What are the firewalls? What are the segmentation? All of those type of things. Then we need to have censoring so that we can detect when a bad guy tries to break in through that firewall or other system. Now, once we detect it, we then need to go into response. And this is where most of our incident response is taken care of. This is where we're going to go and find where the bad guy is, clean them out, make sure the system is restored to the ability, and then we fully recover, which is our final one. And so as you look at all of the different pieces of the framework core, you're going to see identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And these are how we break down all of the functions and all the controls we're going to apply to those particular functions. Now, Kip, the second area we talked about was implementation tiers. Now, what are those?
Right. So there's actually four implementation tiers, and I don't want to like deeply describe each one of them, but let me just generally describe that the first tier is an area that's considered to be unacceptable. Okay, and so it's tier one, and that's when organizations have ineffective cyber risk management methods. Right, it's all haphazard, or things aren't even being done at all. Maybe the organization doesn't even realize that it should be doing any kind of risk management methods. So that's tier one. Nobody should be at tier one. But then there's a tier two, a three, and a four. And the higher you go in these implementation tiers, the more maturity, the more capability that you're actually demonstrating and practicing all the time. Now, the framework, you might say, well, that sounds like a maturity model, and I could see why you would say that. That's what I thought when I first read it. But the framework says, do not call this a maturity model. And when you dig in a little bit, because that seems weird, it's like, why would you build a maturity model and then tell me not to think about it as a maturity model? But what they say in the framework is, look, we don't want anybody to be tier one, but really, if everybody would just get to at least tier two, that's good enough. Now, tier two isn't perfection; it's not world-class security or anything like that. But the people who put together the framework said that you should only go to tier three or tier four if your business can justify it because of the nature of your business, right? So if you're a cryptocurrency exchange handling billions of dollars of cryptocurrency through blockchain, then you probably should be a tier three or a tier four. Or if you're a bank or some other kind of monetary handling institution, then maybe a three or four would make sense for you. But Jason, like you said, I work with companies that are not part of critical infrastructure all the time. So, for example, I've got a customer that is in the entertainment industry. They're actually a professional sports team. They're not critical infrastructure as much as we might think. That professional sports should never miss a game and so forth. And I get that, but they're not critical infrastructure. But they follow the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and they're trying to essentially be in a tier two place for themselves. So yeah, so that's kind of what's going on with these implementation tiers. The truth of the matter is, I don't really talk about them very much in my work. My customers, it helps get them sort of oriented to what they should be doing, but we really don't spend a lot of time on them.
Yeah, I think the important thing when we're talking about this is it does, when I looked at it originally, I thought, hey, this looks like CMMI, and it looked like, the maturity models that I'm used to. And even with those maturity models, the goal is never to get to the top tier. It's to figure out what tier you need to aim for and then get your organization to meet that tier. So in my
Right.
company, tier 2 might be perfectly fine. If I was working for, Bank of America, I might need tier 3 or tier 4, but knowing that helps me decide how big of a budget, what type of controls I need, what type of a profile I'm going to build, and all of those things really do link back to this implementation tier to at least kind of have a ground level of where do I want to be on this 1 to 4 scale. And being
Yeah.
4 isn't the best. If you're spending all this money to reach 4 and you have no business need for it, that's just a waste of money. So you don't want to do that.
You're probably going to lose your job because your senior decision makers are going to be like, look, we make consumer beverage cups that are sold in Starbucks. Like, we're not a bank. You're spending us into oblivion by trying to secure us as a bank. So that's just not going to work. But speaking of profile, let me tell you a little bit about that, what that means in terms of the framework. So when you make a profile, this is actually part of how you use the framework. So you go through the framework. Now, Jason already told you it's got 5 functions, but beneath those 5 functions are 23 activities or categories. The framework uses both as a synonym. I like activities because as somebody who works in management, I like the idea of getting things done. I have sort of a bias towards action. So there's 23 activities and then 108 subcategories, or another term that the framework uses is outcomes, and I like that term better. So when you profile the framework, you're going to look at all the functions, activities, and outcomes, and you're going to say, right, how do I want to measure my organization? And I recommend doing a gap analysis, by the way, when you first are working with the framework, because there's so much territory that you need to cover. And let me give you a couple of examples of how you might profile. So if you're not critical infrastructure, for example, there are some outcomes of some of the 108 that are very, very focused on critical infrastructure, and you can take those out. You might also want to make some adjustments in terms of what the outcomes are actually asking you to do. So, for example, there's an activity around supply chain. Well, maybe you're not ready to tackle cyber risk in your supply chain yet, although I would argue you really need to get on that if you haven't already. But you could take entire activities out. You could take outcomes out. You might even say to yourself, look, there's these 5 main functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. We're so awful at detect that I'm going to profile the framework so that all we're going to do for the next year or two is focus on getting our ability to detect incidents up to an acceptable level, right? Up to that tier 2 or tier 3 or whatever implementation tier it is that you need to be at. But Jason, have you ever implemented the cybersecurity framework in your job?
Yeah, so when we did it, we basically looked at what it was we wanted to accomplish, and we chose the different outcomes, or if you want to think about them as controls, that we wanted to use to be able to meet. And I like the way you had mentioned, you did it on a year-to-year basis. This year, we're going to focus on these things. It's almost like your goals for the year. When we did it, we actually looked at a 5-year plan, and then we broke that down into what are we going to do in the next year, and then year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, because in the government side, we look at things very long term because our budgeting cycles are so darn long. And a lot of things we want to do, if it's going to require a big spend up front, I can't do that until year 3 because it takes me 3 years to get the money that I request. So for us, that's why we did a 5-year plan. But we went through each of these 108 outcomes underneath the 23 categories, and we decided which ones were applicable to us and which ones we wanted to focus on. And we built our profile based on where we wanted to be, where we currently were, and how we were going to get there. And that's really the idea of doing this gap analysis is where am I, where do I want to be, and then what's the delta or the change in between that's going to need to happen. And I think you do that a lot with your customers as well.